coming to you from North Carolina, where the season cannot decide whether or not it is fall or summer or some hybrid in between the two. So tonight we are here with SIBA's Reader Meet Writer events. We've been doing these events since earlier in the summer. We've done dozens of them. They're an absolute blast. You can find them all online. We're featuring writers who have new books out, writers that you would otherwise be meeting in your favorite independent bookstores. But of course, coronavirus got in the way of that, but we are bringing writers to where you are. And I want to tell you a little bit about the Southern Independent Bookseller Alliance. SIBA represents almost 700 independently owned bookstores across the Southeast. And perhaps you are attending tonight's event because one of those independently owned bookstores brought you here. If that is the case, and even if it's not, if you are interested in purchasing tonight's featured book, please, we ask that you purchase it from the bookstore that brought you here. Independent bookstores are the lifeblood of our literary community, and they need our support now more than ever. So before we begin tonight and I introduce our guest, Andrew Reiner, I want to encourage all of you. This is going to be a really interesting discussion. It's a really interesting book. It's a really timely and appropriate topic. If you have any questions about anything you hear, anything that either Andrew or I say, and you want more elaboration, or maybe you want some kind of clarification, go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. When you do so, make sure you mention your name and the name of your independent bookstore, and I will ask Andrew your question as we're winding down toward the end of tonight's program. So make sure you ask your question, make sure you say your name, mention your name and your your favorite independently owned bookstore. So tonight we have a really interesting event, and as I said a few moments ago, a very timely book that I'm excited to discuss, and it's an event that I've been looking forward to for a while. We are with the author Andrew Reiner, and I'll introduce him now. Andrew Reiner is a professor at Towson University, where he offers the seminar Changing Face of Masculinity. He has written on masculinity and men's issues for the New York Times, Italy's La Repubblica, and the Washington Post magazine, and his work has been featured on NPR and Canadian Broadcasting Company, and in The Guardian, Men's Health magazine, and Forbes. He speaks about masculinity regularly at schools and conferences nationally and internationally. His new book is Better Boys, Better Men, The New Masculinity That Creates Greater Courage and Emotional Resiliency. And I just learned that he is joining us from a preschool classroom where he has been teaching his university classes. So maybe he'll tell us a little bit about that. But before we begin, Andrew, first of all, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book, but also your journey as a writer and your background experience with writing, and how you kind of got into the topic of masculinity, teaching about it, thinking about it, and then writing about it?
Sure, absolutely. And I just, real quickly, Wiley, I just want to say thank you so much to SIBA, and thank you to you for being willing to interview me. I love your fiction. And I want to also, of course, thank all the booksellers out there, the independent booksellers, because as you said, they are the backbone of our writing lives and reading lives. And thank you to those of you, if I may say real quickly, to those of you out there who are taking part tonight and having us into your homes. It's dinner time, and even though I don't need any food, I sure could use a Manhattan right now. Okay, so thank you for letting me just get to that. Okay, so the genesis of this book and my work with masculinity actually began with a fist fight when I was about 7 or 8 years old. And the kind of fistfights that took place in my neighborhood were always pretty tame. It was, a couple words, some pent up frustration, a few fists flown, and it was done. And so I got into a fight with this kid when he was about my age too, 7 or 8, and the fight just never ended. It started out, we were pretty much on equal footing. And at some point, as you often do, especially when you're a kid, you lose your nerve. One kid keeps it. He just wouldn't stop hitting me. And so at some point, I even tried to run away. and he just kind of hunted me down and just kept pounding me. And all the kids in the neighborhood showed up for this fight, which didn't typically happen. So it became a really, really big news fight in the neighborhood. And so after the fight, I was pretty bloodied. I was, just covered in blood and tears, basically. And at some point in the afternoon, I found my way home and went in through the back door. And the news had already kind of gotten around the neighborhood. My oldest brother, I heard him talking to my mother about it. And so I'm thinking, okay, he's going to stand up for me. He's going to do something to kind of, cover for his younger brother. But he's screaming at my mother, telling her what a coward I am, and what a black sheep and a disgrace I am to the family. And that became a kind of smear campaign that just went on for decades in my family. And so I tried to fight my way out of that shame. For years, I just tried throughout the rest of my childhood to just get into fights and just fight my way out of it. And I remember in 6th grade, I was fighting a kid named David Parker. And that was the first time in my life where I remember I was, basically just thinking to myself, I don't want to throw another punch. I do not want my fist to hit this kid's face. This is just sickening me. And then after that, I just stopped fighting. And then suddenly it was like this, once my fists were unclenched, there was this just kind of opening, there was this just kind of unclenching of the rest of me. And my consciousness just raised. And I spent the rest of my time in junior high and high school, just really sitting back and watching the way that boys treat each other. And it was just this kind of consciousness raising that stayed with me. And so eventually I guess when I was in my 20s, I just started trying to find ways to push back against it. I still had the fight in me, but I was trying to find ways. I was the flip side of the coin. I was trying to find ways to push back against this. And so when I started teaching at the college level, I started teaching the honors college at the University of Towson where I teach, and they needed some new seminars. And so I came up with the idea of the one you mentioned, The Changing Face of Masculinity. And so I was teaching that course. And I was doing a lot of what a lot of the books on the topic do now, is deconstructing masculinity and kind of, taking a lens and looking really closely at the things that just don't seem to be working for us as boys and men. And then my son was born. And that just, as you can imagine, as a father yourself, that changed everything. Having a boy was a huge just gush of cold water in my face. And so I realized that I had to start looking at this in a whole different way. I didn't have the luxury of just deconstructing masculinity anymore, because what this did was this held up the mirror and made me realize that I'd have to start looking at masculinity in a much more complex way than I had been.
And that leads me to my next question, actually. So with your book, and I want to go back to storytelling in a moment, because that was an incredibly well put story to start us off. I was raised in the Baptist church, so I know the importance of the well-placed story at the beginning. But what kind of things were you seeing in your teaching and the books on the subject that once you had a child of your own, and I read your New York Times piece about when your son was born, there was this panic moment and you were immediately thinking about bullying, all these horrible outcomes, all these challenges.
Yep.
What were some of the failures in the text that you were interrogating in the classroom that you were hoping to round out with your own entry into the subject with this new book? What were some experiences you had, maybe some thoughts you had that you feel like you are bringing that are new or refreshing to the conversation?
Sure. So when I first started teaching the course, I was teaching books like Fight Club, excuse me, which I was very ambivalent about. On the one hand, it's a really compelling book, and it really just goes right into so much about the kind of contemporary masculinity discussion and the tension between, who men are supposed to be and who men really parts of them that they want to be, but they really feel like they can't. And that's just kind of oversimplifying it. But, I was leaning into books like that. I was teaching some other books always trying to find books with memoir that could really kind of bring home the experience in a much more immediate way and a much more visceral way. And so I was teaching some memoir books and things like that. Unfortunately, right now I'm blanking on the titles. And they were all well and good, but one of the things that I felt like the conversation was missing was this idea of vulnerability, this idea of emotional honesty, because none of the books I was coming across, and I mean none of the books I was coming across, were really weighing into that at all. And one of the things I found myself constantly doing is asking the students, I know you love books like Fight Club, and I know that that they're very relatable, but what about the part of the main character that he was ashamed of, that he kept a part of him that was, very consumerist, where he was consuming and buying things and living a lifestyle that a lot of us might say, oh, he's kind of effeminate, he's kind of effete. And I said, but what about that? What is so horrible about not the consumption, but about embracing parts of his being that are kind of off limits in a conventional way for a lot of guys? And they couldn't really wrap their mind around that. All they really saw was the equivalent of Brad Pitt, in this film, buffed, lean, mean, and, just sweeping girls off their feet. So that was part of it, and I wasn't really sure, how to really kind of where I could find something to enter into discussion to change it. And so when my son was born, that was just, like I said, a splash of cold water on my face. And the New York Times piece, that you're alluding to, the fear of having a son, was really hard for me to write because I knew the kind of backlash, if I paid attention, that it would get. I mean, clearly, I just knew that was going to be a ton of backlash. But I think this is a really important thing to look at, which is this idea of, for a lot of us, there is ambivalence about having a son. And the way that a lot of boys, and I noticed this from teaching, I taught middle school for a while, the way that we encounter boys, there are prejudices that we bring into the classroom or that we bring into our awareness of just kind of boys will be boys that some of us really are uncomfortable with. And that some of us that had passive trauma with this, we have a hard time reconciling that. And I wanted to try to find a way to kind of further the conversation and see how I could reconcile that and take the students on that journey too.
I love how you put the idea of reconciling those two halves. And Fight Club is obviously a book that where a character has this bifurcated identity of masculinity, and then this more feminine identity that you referenced. And I'm wondering if some of the other books, when I was teaching at a little liberal arts college in West Virginia, we would teach a January term every year. And one year I taught one on masculinity. And I never interrogated masculinity the way you're describing or the way you do in this book. But we didn't read Fight Club. We read The Last American Man, Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Into the Wild. We read Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison, which are all books where the characters never stop and interrogate their own masculinity. Neither do the writers. Elizabeth Gilbert does not. And John Krakauer very much does not. It's just this straight ahead, barreling down the tracks portrayal of the reaches of American masculinity. What do you think it is? And Song of Solomon, written by a woman, obviously, Toni Morrison, is one of the most masculine books I've ever read. What do you think about it? What do you think it is about American masculinity in particular? Is it the cowboy? Is it Lewis and Clark? Is it astronauts? What is it that makes us reach so much for this grand ideal?
I mean, it's, you look back, so much of it is rooted in our history. It's when de Tocqueville came over here from France in the 1830s and was giving this brilliant take on traveling around the country, as a French young man coming here to see what this American experiment was all about, he was observing and the way that Americans, one of the things he was so prescient observing was the way that Americans just pulled themselves up and even though that they did help each other out, there was some degree of kind of this collectivism in rural environments. It was very much this expectation of the individual going it alone.
Mm-hmm.
You know, everything about our history speaks to that. And the expectation is, you know, for immigrants coming here throughout the centuries, the subtext is you can come and recreate yourself. And what that speaks to is this idea of you do it on your own. It's that mythology that you can come and reinvent yourself. And that's a great mythology to have if you want to start over and you didn't have that opportunity back home. But what's part and parcel of that is it's going to encourage a rugged individualism. And so when you talk about the cowboy, I mean, you know, that's just clearly like, that's the classic embodiment that we still have. And so, you know, there are some good parts of that idea, excuse me, of the individualism, but our economy speaks to that as well. And I won't get, you know, off the rails into economy, but so much of the kind of market capitalism we have encourages that. And I'm not sure it's a chicken and egg thing, whether it's the economy that influences or it's both kind of influence each other. But everything about, you know, American culture speaks to the idea of being the individual, of the strength it requires to kind of endure the struggles. And one of the things that's always missing from that is collaboration,
Mm-hmm.
you know, is the idea of people
Sure.
supporting each other. And that's not, and because of we have this kind of masculinity that we do in this culture, when we think about collaboration in this culture, we think of that as being a feminine trait.
Yeah, and I do appreciate that you brought capitalism into the conversation, because I do feel like capitalism in America, if you ever interrogate capitalism or masculinity, there is societal and political danger and pitfalls in interrogating both of those things, because they are so definitive. We are led to believe they are so definitive of the American dream, of the American identity, that capitalism must run unchecked and that masculinity must also run unchecked.
That's right.
So with that in mind, how did you position your book to really interrogate? What are some new ways of seeing or re-seeing or reimagining masculinity, checking masculinity, redefining masculinity? What are some topics you cover in the book?
Okay, so just as a footnote, I did actually have a section where I was kind of trying to frame, you know, our idea of market capitalism. And I know that it's verboten, right? As you said. And I did, and it was taken out. And I wasn't going off the rails with this, like, you know, political discussion where I didn't belong. I was just making the connection.
I think it's a great connection to make. I'm glad you did.
Thank you for acknowledging that. But, you know, it's where I really wanted to take the book was I really wanted to, when I set out to do this book, I said to myself, you know, I cannot do this book if I don't feel like I'm taking the conversation in another direction. So much of the conversation has been for a while now about, as I said, you know, the same place that I was coming from, just endlessly from every angle deconstructing American masculinity. And I do think that serves a really important purpose. I do think we need to hold American masculinity's feet to the fire. That said, one of the things I also realized, and I realized this first by teaching this course, is that what was missing from the conversation was curiosity, was context, and a degree of compassion and empathy. And those are the things that I felt like when I do this analysis, I've got to bring those things into the conversation, because I feel like one of the things I talk about in the book is how American masculinity, for boys and for men, not just for men, is really static. You know, it's kind of stuck. And one of the things that I think that in that vein that we really need to do is look at it in a way where we're not just finger wagging. Because one of the problems with the way that we've been deconstructing masculinity is that nobody ever changes. People don't change from, you know, people who are intractable and are on the defense don't change with finger wagging. When we look at a lot of the white supremacists out there, wagging our fingers and, you know, and moralizing at them is not going to change their position. When men feel threatened, they dig into what they know. And so I'm not saying that we should make excuses ever for people, but what I'm saying is that we need to also step back and look at this with more context and curiosity and compassion. So that was why when I was thinking about the book, I thought I wanted to look at the biology and the neurology of masculinity. That's something nobody really has done yet. Because I feel like so much of the discussion is still, when you talk about men are from Mars, women are from Venus, the brains are just different, end of story. And as it turns out, they're not at all. 98% of the human brain is a mosaic, that there's shared traits amongst most human brains. I wanted to look at the myth of testosterone, because as it turned out, the way that we view testosterone in this culture, which serves traditional masculinity, is not the way that we thought of it. So I wanted to really examine this idea of testosterone and see how much of this really does really inform this idea of kind of traditional and hypermasculine masculinity. I really wanted to take on the idea of competition. You and I were just talking about the idea of our form of capitalism in this culture. Well, it's competition run amok. And so that's another topic, Wiley, that we really don't really examine. We really don't have carte blanche to say, let's re-examine the way we do competition in this culture. And you have to, when you talk about masculinity, because one of the things I wanted to explore was the role of competition in the way that boys are taught to relate to each other. Because that's a much more nuanced, complex dynamic that we really don't look at. And that informs the reasons why guys have a hard time relating to each other. That's a big part of it. I wanted to look at sports with competition, especially through the lens of football. And I know I'll get a lot of blowback for that, but I feel like, you know what? If I'm going to be looking at another aspect of this, which is competition that we really don't look at, it's really hard not to look at some of these contact sports and the way that they've kind of morphed into not just competing to win, but dominating. Mm-hmm. And the role of domination in our culture today, and how that is kind of taking us down a very slippery slope in boys with sports. I wanted to look at men in their relationships, because I really wanted this to be an arc of in utero through middle age and the places that it's hardest for boys and for men. And so I wanted to kind of frame it. That's the framework, is basically cradle to middle age. And then I wanted to look at what gets in the way for men. And for men, and to a large extent, by the time we're middle-aged, it's our inability to relate, to connect, and the isolation that results from that. And so those are some of the main things that I wanted to look at, that I feel like the things that are really getting in the way for us. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. I try to do it in a way that I'm deconstructing, but I'm also constructing.
Sure.
I wanted to find a phoenix to come out of the ashes, because all we do is put a torch to masculinity. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to find that phoenix through the ashes. And that's the stories of the boys and the men that are leaning into a form of emotional honesty that is giving them the kind of resiliency that so many of us lack today.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I ask my next question, I want to encourage folks, if you're watching this and you have questions or insights or comments or needs for clarification, please go down to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question in there for Andrew, and I will feed him your question. Make sure to mention your name and your home bookstore when you do that. So Andrew, going off what you said about not burning it down, where do you see the contemporary conversation of masculinity? And, not to get, political, but whatever, that's what we do as writers. We are stuck in a really defining moment of toxic masculinity is such an overused term, but we see it with the Proud Boys trying to kidnap the governor of Michigan, the strong, independent woman. We see it with the ways in which, maybe a vice president tries to talk over a female vice presidential candidate. We are in a moment that is defined and limited by masculinity, and the urge, and myself included, is to burn it down, is to try to shout it down and stop it. But there are other approaches, so what kind of things do you see in our contemporary moment that are specific that we're going about tackling incorrectly?
Incorrectly, Wiley?
Yeah, incorrectly.
Okay. Well, I think number one, I think that I think the point is, I do think that the conversation right now, just like traditional masculinity, I do think it's stuck. I think we're in a really static place. And one of the things that I've been trying to do, I've been doing some pieces for the New York Times. And one of the things that I always try to do in these pieces is take a more nuanced approach. I'm trying to move the conversation out of the muck, where we're just kind of, heaping endlessly on all the things that are wrong with men. And again, I do a lot of deconstructing in the book, and I've done it in all the pieces I've done for the Times. I agree with you. I think there's a lot that we need to change that's only going to help boys and men and the rest of us. But I do feel like there's very little nuance to the conversation we're having about masculinity today. I think that to give you an example, I think that when we look at a lot of men and we say that their behavior is toxic, I think we're absolutely right to say that when men are being violent, unnecessarily violent, when they are being, destructive in their families, when they are being bullying, absolutely. But I think that when men are really not doing a great job in communicating in their committed relationships, and when men are, making comments that maybe, for some people they might find very offensive, I don't always think that that's toxicity. I sometimes think that I think that sometimes these are types of behavior that are the product of men who are completely unaware. Mm-hmm. And to sit there and to say that, well, we should just be shaming them. Again, as I said earlier, finger wagging doesn't inspire or motivate people to change. Mm-hmm. It makes them feel shame. And when men feel shame, what they do is they internalize that and they act out on that. It gets externalized in more destructive ways. So when we talk about men, being toxic in nonviolent ways, it's a lot of times it's behavior that I really don't think is toxic. And B, it's just really examples of a kind of static script mm-hmm. that they're still following that they're just not aware of. And a lot of them are sometimes well-meaning men I interviewed in this book, to give you examples of a lot of well-meaning men who, did what they often do when men are kind of with their backs against the wall. That's when they finally start to realize that they need help. That's mm-hmm. what it takes for most men. And so these guys, for instance, their wives were threatening to leave them. And quite a few of the men I interviewed said, that's what got me into therapy. And then they suddenly just had these big aha moments where they realized, I didn't know that this was a problem. I didn't realize that I did not have really language for the way that I was feeling. And so I think that when we look at men and we shame them or blame them for not having access to something that we've never given them access to, I think that that's unfair. And I think it lacks the complexity of what the real problem is.
Mm-hmm. We have some questions coming in, but to the point you just made, to tell a quick personal story. Once my wife and I went to see the musician Nico Case. I don't know if you're familiar with her music. We saw her in Asheville, and she's this very feminine, powerful female singer-songwriter. And the audience was 99% female. I was there with my wife, and I love Nico Case's music. And there was such energy and such power in the room. And we were riding home in the Uber, and I was telling my wife, I said, that was such an amazing experience for me as a man to be surrounded by that much feminine female power. And it was just amazing. And she said, Wiley, I'm a woman and we have 2 daughters at home. And even our cat is female. But perhaps if our daughters and I carried microphones and guitars, you would always feel that way. And to your point, having daughters does force me to constantly discern my direction, my intent. What am I saying? Why am I saying it? Am I saying it automatically? Am I saying things thoughtlessly? Am I acting out thoughtlessly, automatically? And it is a daily assessing if you're willing to do that. And it's uncomfortable and awkward. And sometimes I do feel withdrawn and do feel, disconnected because I'm embarrassed by the things that I've done or said to them, as young children.
Sure. Yeah. And let me just say, to kind of comment to that, Wiley, for what it's worth, I completely agree with what you're saying about the idea of constantly checking ourselves. I guess the point I was trying to make was to speak to, the question that, what are we not getting about men right now in the conversation? And I guess the point I was trying to make is that, I do think we need to be checking ourselves as men, especially. I absolutely, completely agree with that. And I also think that there's aspects of masculinity that we are quick to kind of put the match to that aren't always behaviors of men or ways of being that men are aware of and that they really understand even why they're doing it. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean about the curiosity. It's the idea that there's more complexity here. And that's really what I'm trying to do is taking, like I said, the conversation forward. And the idea that, boys and men, what they really need today is an emotional resiliency that so many of us lack. That really is what they need, to get them stuck out of the dysfunctional behaviors, that are happening in school, that are happening in unemployment, that are happening with opiate overdose and addiction and alcohol and suicides. These all have that common thread of there's a lack of resiliency. And we tend to think of boys and men as being, tough and resilient, but we don't live in the world that our fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers lived in anymore. And so the skill set that we need that you're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. Works, that helps us thrive. But what we need to understand is that's what will give boys and men the emotional resiliency they need just to keep pace with girls and women, just to thrive. And that's what I feel like is missing, is that idea of there is an emotional resiliency that we're lacking, and it speaks to the epidemics that are happening for boys and men.
It's so interesting what you just said about we're not living in the world that our fathers and grandfathers lived in. And I want to get to the questions in a moment. I'm going to stop hogging you in a second. But I was raised, my dad was a pretty traditional, worked out of the house. My mom was pretty much home. She also had a job. And, my wife and I both work from home. She's a photographer, I'm a writer, and we're home a lot. And, I imagine you might be in a similar situation. I feel like our generation of men, there was the idea that women, you try to have it all. You get a degree, you go to the workforce, you have your family. But I see my male friends trying to do that too. And my mom will be at the house and I'll be vacuuming or making dinner. And she's like, "Oh, your dad never did stuff like that. You're such a good dad." And I think, I'm not a good dad because I know how to use the vacuum. Like literally all of my male friends who are dads do this. I'm sorry that our dads didn't, but all of my friends do this. So can you talk about the contemporary moment that dads find ourselves in and the pressures that we are sometimes putting on ourselves to have it all and to step into the roles that our fathers and grandparents might not have been able to?
Well, you're right. It is a pressure. It is. For those of us that care about this kind of thing and that really think about this kind of thing, it is a pressure. It's one of the things that I didn't really get to cover in the book that I feel like really should be part of our conversation move masculinity forward is, a lot of the especially single fathers out there who are dealing with these pressures. And they are very much in exactly what you're talking about. They're trying to be everything to their children that they know that their ex-partners and spouses are being. And they do feel that pressure. And it's something that we really don't think of when it comes to men, because one of the things we often think about with men too is the idea of being endlessly self-sacrificing. That's something we still look to as a kind of, expectation for what a man should be. And I think that I do think there are a lot of men out there, younger men especially, who do feel all these pressures. But one of the things they feel like they can't do is talk about in any kind of public way that they feel these pressures. I was reading, when I was doing all my research, I came across this column by a columnist from the Post, Washington Post, and she was talking about, on the one hand, she was saying, maybe men should be entitled to have new ways of, seeing masculine identity. On the other hand, she said, I recall my grandfather and the fact that, he was endlessly doing things for my grandmother and for the rest of the family. And there were times where, I remember there was a time where he passed out doing something because he just kept pushing himself and pushing himself. And she was glorifying that, and so I'm reading that and I'm thinking that's part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because, one of the things that I talk a lot about in the book with the emotional resiliency that we need is having the full range of access to our feelings and our humanity that we always rightfully give girls and women. And it's not in us versus them. It's the and. It's
Sure.
that we need to give men and boys that same expectation that, for instance, you can make sacrifices if you want to, and if you're doing it because you're fully aware of why you're doing it, but you shouldn't have to do it just because you're a guy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we have some questions that have come in. W. Smith asks, and probably referencing your New York Times article about having a son, how have you applied what you've learned through your research for this book into parenting your son? Great question.
Thank you for that. So what I've done is I check myself a lot. I definitely have gotten better with the help of my wife, as you were saying, of checking yourself in terms of how we think about, the women in our lives. But I also do that with my son. And so one of the things, to give you an example, that I do a lot is that, I'm a pretty reactive person. My son takes after me. He has big feelings. And so one of the things that I have to do in my home, if I tend to be a little reactive with him, and saying something in a way that, maybe I would say in a tone that maybe is unnecessary and that I would use, with somebody else who's older. One of the things that I do is I'll wait a couple minutes, give myself a couple minutes to cool down, and then I will go back to him and I will explain to him why what I was really feeling. And it wasn't just anger. I will tell him exactly what I was feeling. I was afraid that you were doing something that was going to get you, get you into trouble, or that you were going to get hurt. I was afraid, and it's okay to feel afraid. Or I would tell him that I was getting really frustrated because you weren't listening to me. And if I apologize, if I overreacted. So one of the things that I am still wrestling with myself is my reactivity. But one of the things that I can change and I can own up to and be much more accountable with my son and everybody else in my family is going back and saying, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. And this is what I was really feeling. And this is where that was coming from. And it's important that you know that. And you know that I'm also sorry. So that's one of the things that I've been working really hard on, is showing up for my son in ways that I hope he understands. I'm trying to also model for him, not reactivity, but I'm trying to model for him cutting through the excuses of anger and frustration and getting to the crux of what it is that we're really feeling, mm-hmm. and leaning into that and going back and working from there and having a conversation.
That's fantastic. That's great advice. We have another question from Aaliyah. Aaliyah says, what advice would you to break out of this default isolation that many find themselves trapped in at this point in their life?
Yeah, another great question. And that's actually something I'm working. I talk a lot about that in the book, in the chapter on men in relationships. I'm actually working on a piece right now about that for the Times. men need the same kind of emotional network / safety nets that women have. We tend to think of, reaching out and connecting as a very feminine thing, and we've got to get over that. It's one of the things that's part of the skill set we need. We've got to get over that. Men will go to each other for advice. When men I interviewed and boys I interviewed would say things, yeah, I talk to my guy, I talk to my guy friends. All right, what do you talk about? What is it that you open up to them about? Almost always, it was about things that did not really seek out any kind of emotional support. It was about seeking advice. Mm-hmm. Men need to learn emotional support with each other and from each other, because so often we do that with the females in our lives. We feel much more comfortable doing that with them because that feels safer. Mm-hmm. But and I won't get into this now, but one of the things I was talking about is that competition and the way that guys are taught to interact with each other, it doesn't encourage having real emotional honesty with each other. But that really helps tremendously with men, getting out of this mode of isolation, because that's why men's groups, especially with younger men, are becoming a big thing. Therapy is a wonderful thing, but if you don't want to do therapy, you need to find ways to connect with other guys in ways that you're not used to doing that, because it has the same effect. It makes you feel much less isolated.
Well, speaking of competition, the final question that we're going to have time for is from David. Bookmarks in Winston-Salem is his store. He asked, do you discuss the business environment that is male-dominated and really run by intimidation and competition, and how that teaches, the people in the work environment that that are being mentored to be competitive in a work environment, to crush the competition? Do you talk about business in the book and the role of men in business?
I don't. I was originally going to have a chapter on that, and I made the decision to take it out for a few reasons, but I can speak a little bit to that. That is something very much that is the reason that so many women struggle in the workplace, and that one of the things you'll often hear from women is that, they'll feel like they can be themselves in so many other environments, but they can't be themselves in the workplace because they're still beholden to this old boy network kind of mentality of that. You've got to toe that line, and you can't show any degree of vulnerability. And there's something, I think we're kind of on the cusp of hopefully, getting beyond that at some point. Not that people clearly, we don't want to have office places where people are just running around crying all the time. But that said, there does need to be, other aspects of our humanity brought into our work if we're going to be expected to stay in the workplace longer and have to be in environments that are more a part of our life.